Watching the numbers
Oh, I see the numbers.
climb slightly.
Oh, there they are. I see that.
Hag Sameach, everybody, welcome for our
100,000.
Leil Tikkun Shavuot. Called Tikkun because the Israelites overslept, according to the Midrash. And that's why we stay up all night. Isn't that right?
Yeah, but I think it's Tikkun Leil.
Oh, Tikkun Leil. I'm sorry, you're right. Tikkun Leil, that makes sense, more sense. Correct. Tikkun Leil Shavuot. We're fixing Shavuot.
36. Well, the Lamed Vodniks are here, so we can start.
That's right.
Cut it off. Cut it off.
That's it. We're capping it.
More people may join us slowly, but okay, Rabbi Leader, why don't you, well, first of all, hi, everyone. Chag Sameach. We're all here to study a little Torah with you, the 10 Commandments. Each rabbi is going to teach one of the commandments. And Rabbi Leader, do you want to say anything before we begin? Does anyone want to say anything?
Anybody? I'll jump in and say a couple of things preceding what I'm going to be teaching. And just so everyone understands the format, we're each going to teach. Some of us will be teaching one, some of us two, but we're each going to teach a commandment. We're going to speed teach 5 minutes per commandment, and then we're going to, at the end, our cantors are going to do the Aliyah blessings, and then we'll chant the commandments from Parshat Yitro, if you want to follow along. So we'll have about, assuming that all these clergy stay roughly within 5 minutes, we'll have about 4 or 5 hours worth of teaching. And then we will hear the chanting. But seriously, we're going to shoot for about an hour here. We appreciate all of you being with us. And I am the lucky one to begin. And I'm a little
going to mute ourselves and disappear.
Yeah, and Hannah will spotlight each speaker. And yeah, mute, camera off. Very good. Okay. So I have the privilege of talking about the first commandment, which actually is not a commandment at all. I am the Lord your God who led you out of the land of Egypt to be your God. It's a statement. It's not a commandment. So why in the world do we consider it 10 commandments instead of 9? And the reason I suggest is our tradition from the very beginning and until today, in a sense, has emphasized the primacy of God. We talk all the time, mistakenly, about a mitzvah being a good deed, but it's not a good deed. Mitzvah means commandment. And it is impossible to have a commandment, a mitzvah, unless you believe there is a mitzaveh, there is a commander. If there's no mitzaveh, if there's no commander, whatever this is, it's not a commandment. Maybe a suggestion, maybe an important idea, maybe a fundamental belief. But you cannot call it a mitzvah unless you believe there is a mitzaveh. And this is an aspect of Jewish life and Jewish thought that may make many of us watching tonight uncomfortable, but it is the bedrock of what's to follow in the teaching tonight. And it is the tension, it is the dichotomous tension in the Jewish world today, because this is really a commandment, a statement about the primacy of God and therefore our limited, in fact, non-existent autonomy. And all of us here are believers in what we would call Reform Judaism or liberal Judaism or non-Orthodox Judaism. All of these streams of Judaism support the autonomy of the individual. But this first statement, I am the Lord your God who led you out of the land of Egypt to be your God, is fundamentally the opposite of autonomy. Now, before we get to rejectionist about this, I want to quickly mention 3 different areas where we see this embedded in Judaism. The first is Maimonides' Shlosha Asari Karim, his 13 fundamental principles or fundamental truths of Judaism. Listen to what they are very quickly. The belief in the existence of God the Creator, the belief in God's absolute and unparalleled unity, the belief that God is incorporeal, the belief that God is eternal, the imperative, mitzvah, to worship God and no false gods. All prayer should be directed only to God. The belief that God communicates through prophecy, the belief in the primacy of the prophecy of Moses, the belief, here's the important one, in the divine origin of Torah. It is the word of God. It is the word of the mitzvah. The belief in the immutability of Torah, the belief in God's omniscience and providence, the belief in divine reward and punishment, the belief in the arrival of the Messiah, the belief in the resurrection of the dead. And from the Rambam's point of view, anyone who believed in this was essentially a Jew and part of the community of Israel. But anyone who rejected it was an apikoros, was somebody to be thrown out of the Jewish people and to be reviled. Okay, Rabbi, that's terrible. Well, maybe it is, but how many of us have sung Adon Olam in synagogue at the end of a service? Pretty much all of us. How many of us know what the words mean? Probably not most of us. Adon Olam Asher Malach B'Terem Kol Yetzir Nivra. You are the eternal God who reigned before any being had been created, when all was done according to your will, and you were called ruler. Okay, Azai Melech Shamo Nikra. After all ceases to be, you alone will rule in majesty. You have been and are still and will be in glory. You are one, none other can compare. You are without beginning, without end. To you belong power and dominion. And you are my God, my living Redeemer, my rock in times of trouble and distress. You are my standard bearer, my refuge. You are there for me when I call on you, and into your hands I entrust my spirit when I sleep, when I wake, and my spirit and body together. Adonai is with me, I shall not fear. So the Rambam's 13 Principles of Faith. Adon Olam, Yigdal, which I'm going to ask Cantor Gurney to share literally 20 or 30 seconds about, and then I'm going to wrap up my view of why this commandment is so foundational and so problematic at the same time. Go ahead, Don. Unmute.
Sorry.
There you go.
Yigdal illustrates everything you just shared with us about the nature of God in its poetic form. This melody that, like Adon Olam, many of us are familiar with. The opening starts, Yigdal Elohim Chai v'yish tabach. That verse, magnified and praised be the living God. God's existence is eternal. God's unity is infinite. God is unfathomable. God's oneness is unending. And the final phrase, Chaye olam neta betochenu baruch hadei shem tehilato. God has implanted eternal life within us. Blessed is God's glorious name to all eternity.
Perfect. And so here you have these 3 examples, and there are many more. The most important of which is the first of what we call the 10 Commandments, but it's a statement of faith. I am the Lord your God who led you out of the land of Egypt to be your God. And if we remove this idea of God as mitzvah, God as commander, then we have this new world of autonomy in Judaism, which is something we all enjoy and embrace, but it's also incredibly problematic when it comes to creating boundaries and limits on our own decisions so that we remain a community as one. Next, I think David Eschel is up with commandment number 2.
That's me. Yes. All right, here we go. I'm gonna move this out of the way. Commandment number 2. Wait, Rabbi Leader, pop on again for a second, please.
Yes, sir.
Can you read? because this is fascinating. What you just said about Maimonides. Can you start again where you said with his list?
Sure. The
Okay,
belief
go.
in the existence of God the Creator.
Okay, next.
The belief in God's absolute and unparalleled unity.
Okay, stop right there.
I did.
All right, so we're gonna go from there. You can pop off now. Thank you so very much. So this is fascinating because, all right, so we're gonna get to the second one. I'm gonna share my screen with everybody right now. Here, I'm gonna read it out for you. Check it out. Here it is. You shall have no other gods besides me. You shall not make for yourself a sculptured image or any likeness of what is in the heavens above or in the earth below or in the waters under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them. For I, your God, Adonai, am an impassioned God, visiting the guilt of the parents upon the children, upon the third and upon the fourth generations of those who reject me, but showing kindness to the 1,000th generation of those who love me and keep my commandments. Now, wait a second. So this is fascinating. So what Rabbi Leader just read, coming from Maimonides, is this idea of chai v'kayam, that it is there, and there is no end and no beginning. There's the complete and utter powerful unity of God, meaning the oneness, right? Like we chant together in Shema. However, what I've learned in getting ready for this fabulous day is that is actually not a biblical idea. It is not a biblical idea in the unity and oneness of God in totality, that no other gods, at least in these people's belief system, exist, right? And we even see that evolution, right? We even see that evolution when we say, oh, who is this one? Who likes this one? Right? When we chant Micha Mocha, who is like you, Adonai, among the celestials? So who are these other celestials? Who are these other gods? Who is like you, majestic in holiness, awesome in splendor, working wonders, right? So this is in Exodus. We have this in Exodus. And then it's not until, get ready for this, it's not until Deuteronomy that we start seeing this idea of oneness, specifically first in Shema, but then get ready for this. I said it wasn't biblical, however, it is in Deuteronomy, but scholars teach that this did not actually get incorporated into Deuteronomy until the time of 2nd Isaiah, which we'll take a look in a second, right? So this is what is being taught in Deuteronomy 4:19. And when you look up to the sky and behold the sun and the moon and the stars, the whole heavenly host, you must not be lured into bowing down to them or serving them. These your God Adonai allotted to other peoples everywhere under heaven. All right. So check this out. Right here in Deuteronomy 4, it's saying, all right, I'm going to be with you. And the sun and the stars and the moon, I gave that to other people to worship. But you and I, we're going to be like this together. And then again in Deuteronomy 32, check it out. It says, when the Most High gave nations their homes and set the divisions of humanity, God fixed the boundaries of people in relation to Israel's numbers. For Adonai's portion, meaning for God, maybe the other celestials, they got everybody else, but God's portion is the people of Jacob, God's own allotment. This is for God. So even here you see, right? All right, now check out. Here's where things start to change. We're looking in Isaiah. Okay, we're looking in Isaiah. And this is already, right, after the destruction of the temple, Babylonian, here we are. It says, see, they are all, and this is God talking about through Isaiah about other gods, they are all nothingness. Their works are nullity. Their statues are naught and nil. And then I'm going to go down right here. Again with Isaiah, says, thus said the Lord, the King of Israel, their Redeemer, the Lord of hosts, I am the first and I am the last, and there is no God but me. So we're like, well, wait a second. Everywhere else in the Torah, it's saying, oh, well, it's me and there's all these other guys hanging out, but I'm like the real deal. It's not until towards the end in Deuteronomy, based on the teachings from Isaiah, 2nd Isaiah, it says here, in Deuteronomy 4:35, it has been clearly demonstrated to you that Adonai alone is God. There is none else. Now, that kind of blew my mind a little bit there. So it's this idea of monotheism, right? Evolves because there's different levels of monotheism, right? First, there's this idea in monotheism that this is one God, that this is our God, this is what the God we're going to focus on, versus some of these other gods that we're having nothing to do with it. We're going to just focus on this one. Then there's this idea of numerical monotheism, right? That there is this one God, but in numerical monotheism, it relates directly to the anthropomorphizing of God in it throughout Torah, right? That God sees, you don't look upon my face. God is angry. God was over here and heard my people crying, so I had to come back over here and help them, which lends itself to the idea that God does have an end and a beginning, right? But then with this idea of Isaiah, from Isaiah 2, and then, which I love that Rabbi Leader used the Maimonides piece, because it is then with Maimonides, right, that we start going into this philosophical monotheism with this idea, as he read, that there is no end and no beginning, and God is the ultimate unity, the ultimate one. And that's it from me. Chag Sameach, everybody.
Don't go anywhere.
I'm not going anywhere. I'm not going to leave.
I have a question for you.
Uh-oh.
I feel like you've started a pattern where
I like it.
Okay. Rabbi Eshel.
Yes.
How did God create the world?
With words, right? Said
Excellent answer.
And God said.
Yes. And have you heard the phrase, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me?
Yeah, I'll tell you what, the dude who invented that was never a seventh grader. I'll tell you that much right now.
That's true. And not Jewish.
And not
Thank
Jewish.
you.
You're
Thank
welcome,
you, Hi, everyone. Yes, God created the world with words. Let there be light, and there was light. And whoever came up with the phrase, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me, also not Jewish, because we as a people know that words have the power to create and they have the power to destroy, as we know from the creation of the world itself. Commandment 3 is about, again, the power of those words. We're starting to transition from this idea of theology with Commandments 1 and 2, slowly but surely into the relationship between humans with one another. We're going from relationship between God and humanity to, as we will see in a few commandments, starting with honoring mother and father, really the transition into the relationship that we have with one another. So we're really starting to get there with commandment number 3. And commandment number 3, for those who may not remember it, is basically, it says, you shall not swear falsely by the name of Adonai your God. Now, this has been taken traditionally in a variety of ways. One is this idea of bracha levatala, this idea that you shouldn't be offering a blessing at the improper time. In other words, don't say motzi if you don't have bread that you're about to eat, or make sure that you are not using the actual name for God in a blessing if you're just teaching it and you're not offering that blessing. That's why sometimes more traditional Jews will say Elohim as opposed to Elohim, right? So that the idea that there are certain times when you are supposed to use God's name and other times when you are not. For example, another reason would be why people use the word Hashem as opposed to another name for God. Hashem literally being translated as the name, using that instead of another name for God, such as Elohim, etc. The idea being you don't want to use God's name in a way that's improper. As liberal Jews, we don't abide by that in the same way, obviously, but it's this idea that God's name holds something special. But the rabbis were not stuck on just this idea that we shouldn't use the name improperly. It's not just that we shouldn't write out Yud He Vav He, or as you can see, sometimes people will even in English, and I sometimes come across this with bar and bar mitzvah students who will do G-D. And I have to ask them usually, well, why are you using the dash? And they say, well, usually it's because someone in their family has done that. And they don't really necessarily know why they're doing that, but it's, again, actually connected to commandment number 3, the idea that you're not supposed to use God's name in an inappropriate way, or at a time where that paper may be tossed away, etc. We should all realize, though, of course, that the name of God is not the word G-O-D. So that's my own personal opinion, that we don't need to worry about G-D as potentially breaking commandment number 3. But the rabbis move away not only from this idea that you shouldn't use God's name when you're not officially doing a prayer, into a different space. And the space they go into is this idea that if you think about it, and if you were to read, and maybe you can pull up on Sefaria.org, the 10 commandments themselves as we're going through these, there are only 2 commandments out of the 10 that have either a reward or punishment explicitly associated with them. This one, commandment number 3, and commandment number 5. Commandment number 5 has an explicit reward, and it says, you honor your father and your mother, that you may long endure on the land that your God is assigning to you. So that's the reward. The only explicit punishment associated with any of the 10 commandments comes with commandment number 3 about not swearing falsely in God's name. And that says, you shall not, the whole verse reads, you shall not swear falsely by the name of your God, Adonai, for Adonai will not clear one who swears falsely by God's name. So the rabbis take this as clearly a sign that this is a significant commandment, because no other commandments, even the ones about murdering and stealing and adultery, don't have an explicit punishment associated with them. So what is it about this that makes it so serious? In modern day, we may say, using God's name in vain, is that really a big deal at all? Like, is that really going to lead to a punishment? Well, the rabbis see it's not just about using the name, because the word for swearing falsely actually is the word shav in Hebrew. And the word shav really means emptiness or vanity or worthlessness, that this is really a commandment against using empty speech. Now, how do we imagine what empty speech looks like? It's really a commandment about any time that we are speaking in which we are actually not adding to the world. If you think about our tradition and what we are supposed to do as Jews, we are supposed to make this world a better place. And I don't just mean tikkun olam. The whole idea of the 613 commandments is that altogether, they give us a roadmap by which we individually and collectively can make this world a place full of justice, full of love and compassion. You can't do that if your speech is mostly based on really not adding anything to the world, but only detracting from the world. If you think about social media today, if you think about some of the debates that people are having, both on social media, but let's be honest, even with one another, there is not really much of an additive element to some of those debates. They're not really even debates. They are more just soliloquies and monologues in which someone is offering their perspective without really opening the door for one of the most important of Jewish values, which is machloket, which is debate, which is the ability for people to disagree with one another in a way that can lead them to, according to our tradition, arguments for the sake of God. What do you mean by an argument for the sake of God? One in which we are attempting to bring more holiness into the world. If you think about Leviticus 19, the idea of bringing holiness into the world is not just through our speech, it's through our actions. But what commandment number 3 is doing is really trying to blend together the 2 elements of the 10 commandments, our relationship with God and our relationship with one another. That when we start by having vain speech or empty speech when it comes to God, in other words, if we are making oaths, if we are back in the day, a long time ago, making an oath for God was basically making a promise and saying that you are making this promise under the guise of your connection or relationship to God. Now, that may not have as much weight today, but you imagine anything today in which you make a promise or a contract. If we want to think about when you sign a contract, it's the same idea. Signing a contract and then going back on your word of that contract. That's really what this commandment is about. And how can we create a world and a society of honesty if people are going back on their words? And according to Ibn Ezra, one of our ancient commentators, this commandment, the punishment associated with this and breaking this commandment is worse than anything else that is going on. Because if you break this, then you are more prone to doing this over and over and over again. And so we need to be very aware that commandment number 3, let's make sure that we add to the world with our speech and not detract from it. So with that, we move on to the next commandment. Thank you.
Thanks, Joel. Amazing. So commandment number 4, here we go, is Shabbat, which in the context of, murder and adultery and lying and idolatry might seem a bit pedestrian, I suppose. But I would argue that Shabbat is the cornerstone of our tradition, the cornerstone of what has made us who we are and has sustained us for, at this point, thousands of years. Now, many of us may or may not know that there are actually 2 versions of the 10 Commandments in the Torah, one in Exodus, one in Deuteronomy. They're by and large the same, very similar, but there are a few key differences, and those differences are exemplified, more than anywhere else in this imperative relating to Shabbat, in this 4th commandment. So in Exodus, we are told to remember, Zachor, to remember Shabbat, that we should perform no labor, neither us nor our children, our manservants, our maidservants, our beasts, the stranger who is in our cities, because for 6 days God, in the story as it goes in Genesis, for 6 days God created the world, and on the 7th day God rests. And as a result, God blesses the 7th day and makes it holy. So in the Exodus narrative, Shabbat is something that we remember because we remember the idea that God rested when God created the world. Right? It is a remembrance. It is an observance in that sense. Now, in Deuteronomy, coming later in the Torah, toward the end of the Torah, we are instructed that we are meant to shamor et Shabbat, to observe, to guard, to keep Shabbat, to perform no labor, neither us, our children, our manservants, our maidservants, our ox, our donkey, our livestock, not the stranger in our cities, so that our maidservant, manservant, so that the people who work for us can rest as we do. Again, so that the people who work for us can rest as we do. And we ought to remember that we were slaves in the land of Egypt, and that God brought us out of that slavery and bondage with a strong hand and an outstretched arm. And as a result, God commands us to observe Shabbat. So in Deuteronomy, we're instructed that Shabbat matters for 2 reasons. One, to pay it forward to those who work for us so that we can give them what we benefit from. And 2, as an expression of our freedom, not because God rested, but because we are now free. And one of the ultimate expressions of freedom is the ability to choose not to work, the ability to choose to rest, to take a break. And I think that the innovation of Judaism is this very notion, the idea of prioritizing time over space, making time that which is sacred, holy, different, not just space. Right? That is what Shabbat is. Carving out these 25 hours in time, differentiating them from the rest of the week, saying it is different. Right? Abraham Joshua Heschel famously talked about the idea that Jews did not create these cathedrals, these sanctuaries in physicality, despite the beauty of our sanctuary at the Glazer campus, right? But, all kidding aside, it's just a pretty room. There's no theological belief that it is inherently holy, right? What is holy is time. What is holy is the space and the time that we create through Shabbat. And the beauty of that is that it can't be destroyed, right? You can take Shabbat anywhere. Buildings can be torn down, buildings can be burned. Shabbat can go anywhere. And I think that is what has kept our people united. It's what's kept our people alive through millennia in diaspora and in exile. As Ahad Ha'am, the poet famously said, more than Shabbat has kept the Jewish people has kept Shabbat, right? More than the Jewish people has kept Shabbat, Shabbat has kept the Jewish people. There's something about Shabbat that nourishes us, that keeps us. And so I'll conclude with one more thought from Abraham Joshua Heschel, who taught that the meaning of Shabbat is to celebrate time rather than space. 6 days a week, we live under the tyranny of things of space. On Shabbat, we try to become attuned to the holiness in time. It is a day on which we are called upon to share in what is eternal in time, to turn from the results of creation to the mystery of creation, from the world of creation to the creation of the world. This sanctuary in time is there every single week. That's the beauty of what we as a people have created. It is there for us each and every week if we but enter it. Commandment number 5.
Hi, everyone. I am going to be doing commandment number 5, which is, as Rabbi Nickerson mentioned, honor your father and mother, that your days may be long on the land that your Lord, that God has given you. In other words, honor your parents so that you will have a long life. Just how important is this commandment? Well, in the Talmud, there is a list of just 10 commandments of all the 613 and about which is written that these are the things that are limitless, that you will get reward in this world, but even more reward in the world to come. In other words, when you perform these commandments, yes, there's reward in your life now, but in the next world, even more reward. And the first commandment listed is honor your mother and father, honoring your mother and father. That's number 1. Also, usually we look at the 10 commandments and we divide them 5 and 5. The first 5 are between God and humanity. And the second 5 are between people, between humanity and humanity, dealing with each other. One would think the 5th commandment is on the first 5. Why is it considered between God and humanity? Because there's a teaching that there are 3 people when a person is born. When a person is created, there are 3, not people, 3 forces: the mother, the father, and God. God participates in the creation of each human being according to the tradition and the midrash. And therefore, when you dishonor your parents, you're also dishonoring God. So what does it mean to honor your parents? First of all, it doesn't say love your parents. It says honor your parents. What does that mean? And I want to point out that in Hebrew, the word for it says kabed et avicha v'et imecha. Kabed, honor. There is a word in Hebrew that's very similar, kaved, which means heavy, because sometimes taking care of your parents is a burden, it's heavy, it's difficult, but it's still one of the most important mitzvot. So the rabbis, of course, in the Talmud don't just suggest it, they give you exact direction of what it means to honor your parents. So, of course, you have to provide them with food and drink and shelter. It also says conduct them home and take them out, which I think is interesting. Visit them, take them out for dinner, take them out. Don't leave them at home, don't neglect them. You have to conduct, take them in and take them out. And whatever you do for them has to be cheerfully and graciously. Even if you give your parents a sumptuous gourmet meal, if you're doing it begrudgingly, you're not fulfilling the mitzvah. Also, you should not sit in your parents' seat, like your father or your mother have special seats at the table, and don't take their place in any city council. You can't replace them. You never correct them in public. And you also stand when they enter and honor them that way. And it says, actually, how far should you go? It says in the Talmud, if you're attired in beautiful garments, presiding over a meeting, and your parents come and tear your clothes, hit you on the head and spit in your face, you still must be gracious and honor them. So they're pretty extreme in the way that they understand honoring. They also say that you have to honor your step parents. It's not just your parents, but your step parents. And even some suggest your older siblings if they're much older. Another thing that they tell you is that if somebody is asleep, one of them is asleep, you cannot wake them. Even if the key to your house is under their pillow and they're sleeping, you are not allowed to rouse them. You cannot do anything to create discomfort in their lives. So then we have a question, what about abusive parents? How do we treat them? Or what about parents who tell us to do something wrong? And the Talmud is very clear on that. If your parent orders you to do something that is against the Torah, you must not obey them. You do not listen to them. If your parents are very abusive, also they are reproved and you don't have to honor them. And they go so far as to say that you should not create fear in your children. You should not create, nervousness. They even talk about in the Talmud, one son who was so afraid of his father's anger that he killed himself. And they talk about that you're not a parent. Also, they say, should not be harsh. They tell the parent, you can't push your children too far. So it goes in both directions. Also, the rabbis talk about what if your parent is mentally ill? Or what if you can't take care of your parent? You are allowed to hire someone to take care of your parent, to do it for you if you're not able to do it, which I think is a comfort to people who find they're overwhelmed or they're not so young themselves, but you still should visit them, take them in and take them out. Finally, I always have this question, what are parents supposed to do for their children? We're supposed to honor our parents. Do our parents have any obligation to their children? And yes, they do. They must educate their children. If it's a son, he must be circumcised. You must teach your child a trade. You must teach your child to swim. It's very clear. It says swimming, and some commentaries say it means how to swim through life, how to navigate, how to negotiate, how to make it in the world. And finally, you must find your child a spouse, a partner. So for all you parents who have unmarried adult children and you're trying to fix them up with somebody and they complain about it, you should say, well, it's in the Talmud. I have to do this. It's my obligation. So it's a very complex mitzvah with lots of parts, and I find it very interesting. And now we move to the sixth commandment. Rabbi Davids. Hello. Hi.
Hey, thank you very much, Susan. Profound stuff. When we spend the evening like this talking about the 10 Commandments, we really would like to feel that the 10 Commandments at least structures the way in which we live our normal lives. How many of us have heard individuals say, I don't need the whole Torah, I keep the 10 Commandments, by which they really mean we haven't committed adultery lately. The 10 Commandments lay out structures necessary to control the world in which we live. My commandment this evening is to talk about murder. Lo tirtzach, you shall not murder. How do we get into that kind of a discussion this evening without thinking back on the 19 children, the children who were murdered, slain, the others who were murdered over the past weeks, months, and years? The fact is, we live in a society in which murder is very easy to accomplish and somehow does not represent something which we are supposed to bring an end to. And here it is in the 10 Commandments. We are not supposed to murder. Okay, all murder is killing, but not all killing is murder. Jewish law makes that very, very clear. For example, if the nation is attacked, you are expected and required to act in your self-defense. So going into battle in self-defense, that is something worked extremely well with. Killing is not murder. What else beyond that? Capital punishment. We'll talk about that in a minute. Capital punishment is permitted under Jewish law. There are 4 kinds of capital punishment mentioned in the Torah, and the laws require capital punishment because of certain specific crimes. Killing, not murder. Self-defense, judicial, military. There are primary sins in Jewish life. There are that. Adultery is a primary sin. Idolatry is a primary sin. Murder is a primary sin. These are, if you will, the 3 at the very, very top of the list. Shvichut damim. Whoever sheds blood, by others, their blood shall be shed. My friends, we're dealing with here a question of, is life of infinite value? Is all taking of life sinful? Or can life be taken in fulfillment of loftier moral and ethical goals? When the rabbis come to apply capital punishment within the Talmud, they do so in a manner which is utterly incredible, so difficult to apply. You need to have a detailed warning of the potential perpetrator. You need to have 2 unambiguous witnesses. You need to have proof, unambiguous proof of the use of a murder weapon. Very hard to pin murder on someone. It also sets up a structure in which an accidental killer, accidental murderer, may flee to a city of refuge. If you have an ox, and that ox is known to kill, and that ox kills, you are subject to capital punishment. You are a murderer through the agency of the ox. If someone breaks into your house in the middle of the night, a burglar, Jewish law says you may kill that person. Interesting. What is the value of human life and how is it negotiated? The Torah, wonderful, sets up 4 ways to undertake capital punishment. Okay, it's terrific. Stoning, burning by ingesting molten metal, strangling, and beheading. Which one of those is the most humane of all? Interestingly, in Israel, capital punishment has been applied only 2 times since the founding of the state. One was for Adolf Eichmann. If we murder another, we are diminishing the image of God. We are to save human life, even if that requires violating Shabbat. But friends, prevention is a sacred act. When it says don't murder, it says to us, don't murder and act to prevent. Prevent the taking of a human life. Does that sound like a matter of current and potential interest to us all? Yeah, I think it really does. We are forbidden to stand idly by while someone we know or someone we don't know, a different human being, is under physical attack. This commandment, lo tirtzach, demands an affirmative action from us. We are to protect human life, not only to withhold our own hands from carrying out a murder. The plague of murder is one of the most horrific plagues to affect human existence, and today it rises up as one of the most awful things our civilization has to confront. End with this. Lo hamidrash ikar ela hamaaseh. If it says don't murder, it's not good enough to study about it. It's not good enough to know murder is wrong. What we are required to do is to act to prevent murder. That's what the commandment means at its very core. Lo hamidrashikar. Enough talking about commandments we don't pay attention to. Go out and make the world a better place, because that's our task as human beings.
Thank you. That was so powerful, Rabbi Davids. Thank you so much. What struck me is that the next commandment, the seventh commandment, is do not commit adultery. And it is do not murder the family structure. Do not destroy the family structure. And it's right after do not murder, there's physical murder, and then there's emotional murder, which happens when a marriage or a family is destroyed through infidelity. So that part I like very much. However, as a woman and a feminist, I wanted to talk about this commandment because you may think adultery means if a married man and a married woman have who are not married to each other have sexual intimate relations, but that's not what Jewish adultery is. Jewish adultery is only if it's the woman is married, and whoever the man is, married or unmarried, she's committed adultery. A married man is not considered an adulterer if he has sex with an unmarried woman. That's not considered adultery. We know there was polygamy in biblical times. There were concubines. That was not what this was talking about. It was really talking about the woman. And not only a married woman could be accused of adultery, she's committing adultery, but if you're engaged and you have sex with someone beside your fiance, that's considered adultery. And as Rabbi Stan said, the punishment was death originally, and it was stoning, strangling, or burning. It was pretty severe. And in early biblical times, it was up to the patriarch of the family to make the decision. And even if there wasn't total proof, there was an accusation, or it seemed like it was true, both the male adulterer and the female would be punished. The man who slept with the married woman would be also punished. However, in Talmudic times, the rabbis decided this could not be at the hands of the family or the tribe. It had to go through the courts. And again, as Rabbi Stan said, they made the rules for being accused of adultery very strong. There had to be 2 witnesses, and there had to be a warning to the couple that you are, being accused or people are watching you, and to stop. And if they still continued, then they would be punished. But the punishment would really be that the man would be scourged or beaten, and the woman would be divorced and lose all her property or all her rights that were in her ketubah. Also, they made it very clear she could not marry the man that she had cheated with. And if they were together, they had to be separated. So if you had a horrible husband and you took a lover and you loved him and you wanted to be with him, no, you could not. However, they had a caveat, which I found fascinating. If you get divorced, if your husband divorces you for adultery, and then you, the woman, marry another man, and then you divorce him, and then you marry your original lover, that would be accepted. So that was pretty interesting. What's really disturbing is this idea of the sota, or the ordeal. If a husband suspected his wife of infidelity, and he went to the rabbis and said, I think she's cheating on me, they put the woman, only the woman, through this very arduous, bizarre ritual. They took her to the court and went to the temple or to the altar or to the Mishkan, wherever it was at the time. 2 doctors examined her. I don't know what they looked for, but they examined her. And they were trying to intimidate her to confess. If she didn't confess, they took off her headdress, which, uncovering your hair was considered, very lascivious. They ripped open your shirt so that your breasts were shown, and you stood there for several hours, and they still waited for you to confess in front of everyone. The only people who couldn't witness this were the woman's servants, but everybody else could see this. Then if she still said, I didn't do anything, they gave her an offering of very coarse grain to bring as a sacrifice. And they said, this is the food of cattle. That's how low this act was considered. And then they took, I guess, water, and they put dust from the Mishkan. They wrote out a series of curses and then wiped the ink into this water and made the woman drink it. And they said, if she gets bloated, she's guilty. Otherwise, she's innocent. This could be a crazy husband who's, insanely jealous, and he sees things that are, she would have to go through this horrible ordeal. Also, what does bloated mean? They say she will swell up. Maybe this concoction, but really it's psychological. They keep thinking, if you're guilty, you're going to collapse under this. But this is what a woman could be put through just for her husband's suspicions. Now, this whole sota thing stopped. They say 40 years before the destruction of the Second Temple, all the killing stopped. They stopped doing it. And basically, divorce and shame became the punishment. And a man could divorce his wife for any reason, even if he was attracted to another woman and he wanted to divorce her, he could. So it wasn't until very recently that women also had grounds for divorce if their husband was unfaithful to them. So it's taken us a long time to reach parity, but committing adultery was a serious, serious offense with extreme and severe consequences. And now we go to number 8.
Thank you so much. We've reached the 8th commandment, thou shalt not steal. Seems simple enough. In fact, it's one of the first commandments we teach our children at a young age. You know exactly what I'm talking about. We push our child through Target in a shopping cart. They try to grab that Snickers bar from the checkout stand, and we teach them that the Snickers bar is not ours until we pay for it, passing ownership of that delicious candy from retailer to private citizen. That simple lesson in the supermarket is the foundation for understanding ownership of items. If something doesn't belong to you, it's not yours to take. That's it, right? Not quite. People break this commandment all the time, even well-intentioned, thoughtful, smart, generous individuals just like you and me. Now, my hope is these incidents are accidental and small in scale. For example, I think about a time when my daughter was little and I was using my stroller as a shopping cart. Kids have lots of stuff. You don't have enough hands for strollers and carts and diaper bags. I unloaded my items onto the conveyor belt, paid the kind cashier, and went on my way. I get to the car, I place all my packages in the trunk, only to discover, as I imagine you see where this is going, a pack of pens that had ended up wedged in the corner of my stroller basket. Horrified, I was absolutely horrified that I inadvertently stole from a store. I picked up my daughter, went back to the store, apologized profusely. I think the lady thought I was crazy, and paid for my previously stolen item. Okay, we know that the store wouldn't even realize that the pack of pens was gone, nor would it have created a serious financial hardship for the company. But that wasn't the point. The point was I had done something that I shouldn't have done and needed to make it right. But is this the type of situation that the Torah is talking about with this commandment? Mishnah Torah gives us a little more insight into the parameters of what should be deemed as stealing. Who is in transgression of the commandment, you shall not steal? Anyone who steals property worth a penny or more, and it's forbidden to steal even the smallest amount. The atonement for stealing is by payment of the principal and a fine. So basically, the thief needs to repay. The text goes even further to tell us that repayment is required, and it makes no difference whether one steals the property of a Jew or a non-Jew, or whether one steals from an adult or a minor. It's likewise forbidden to steal in jest or to steal with the intention of returning the object or paying for it. And then it says, all is forbidden lest one may become addicted to it. So that's the reason we don't steal, is that you might become addicted to the act of it. It's not about that initial act, but rather that action may lead to it becoming a routine behavior. Is it maybe the adrenaline rush, the thrill, the secrecy of the act? I'm going to leave that there for a second. Ibn Ezra, a prominent Jewish biblical commentator from the Middle Ages, offers a little more insight into this commandment. He writes, the understanding of ganiva, of theft, is taking money in secret. And there's a thief who is to be put to death like someone who steals a soul of Israel, whether he is a small youth or even one of an undiscerning tongue. And the stealing of money mentioned is whether it is in front of the victim or not, or that he tricked him in calculation or measurement or weight. Here, it's not only about the stealing of money in its entirety, but that tricking someone in calculation, measurement, or weight is also considered stealing. I'm not into this, but I see people grab a few grapes from the bag as they stroll by the produce department. Is this stealing? Yes. Does the person doing it think about it in the biblical commandment sense of stealing? Probably not. Many of us have cut the cord and no longer pay for cable. Great, it's a nice way to save some money. But what happens when we use our parents, friends, roommates' Netflix login information instead of purchasing our own account? Or use our neighbor's Wi-Fi instead of paying the monthly fee ourselves? Anyone remember burned CDs? An entire generation of adults grew up stealing music through Napster, LimeWire, and other illegal websites, and then copying that music for our friends and love interests. Are these not examples of stealing? While these examples may not have been the original intent when God revealed these commandments to Moses and Israel and the Israelites in the desert, I think it's important to remember that stealing isn't just about grabbing that Snicker bar or a few grapes out of the bag. In our modern world, we've expanded our understanding of ownership and what belongs to us, tangible or not. So the next time you go to sign into Netflix to watch Fauda, The Great British Baking Show, or even The Crown, maybe you'll think about signing up for your own account. And I'm going to pass it over to Rabbi Joel Simons.
That was absolutely wonderful. Thank you. So here we are at our 9th commandment. And as Rabbi Nickerson said earlier, our 9th commandment is a connection to our 3rd commandment. It expands upon it, yet it still keeps it vague. Do not give false testimony against your neighbor. Now, for so many of us, when we hear and see this commandment, we think primarily of the justice system, of the courts, that when one is giving testimony, one needs to be honest and true. And yet, I want to look at this word in the Hebrew, re'echa, neighbor. See, for so many of us, the word re'echa reminds us of something else in a few more verses in the Torah, from Leviticus, the Holiness Code, where it says, ve'ahavta l'recha kamocha. You must love your neighbor as yourself. And we ask, how do we love our neighbor as ourselves? And we're given all these examples for how we do it. But one of the ways in which we love our neighbor as ourselves, one of the ways in which we keep a society that is filled with love and care, is by looking at our neighbor and trusting our neighbor and not lying. Not lying when we're in the courtroom and not lying when we're in the general public sphere. You see, when creating these 10 commandments, when looking at what the society was going to be, the framers and founders of our Judaism knew that if we were to have a justice system that was not truthful and honest, then we were going to descend into chaos. So why, of all of the opportunities to put into the 10 commandments, why is this one there? Because without it, without a fair and truthful justice system, then we are no longer going to be that kingdom on earth that God wanted us to be. And so when we look at this word re'echa, when we go back to it, there are so many other places throughout Torah where it doesn't say your neighbor. It says your fellow Jew, achicha, your brother, but we can make that to, all of us. But why here? Why doesn't it say that you shall not bear false witness against just your brother? Because here it's saying that if we only are honest with our fellow Jews, but we are dishonest with the rest of the world, it doesn't work that way. Truth doesn't have borders. Truth goes beyond the walls. And so when we're looking at this commandment, we know that it's thinking about the justice system back then, and specifically about the justice system today. And the system in which we all buy into, that when one gives testimony, we are all neighbors. From the person who lives next door to the person who you never met, to the person across state lines. We have to enter this with a sense of truth and with a sense of honesty. And so when we look at the importance of this commandment, it's asking us to expand upon number 3, to look at what it means to offer testimony. Because keep in mind here, and this was mentioned in previous commandments, words matter. Testimony matters. A person's life is at stake in a testimony. And if a witness in that trial gives a false claim, well, that can tip the balance. So we're not just talking about simple matters of stolen property. When one gives false testimony, one can sentence an individual to death. One can destroy an entire world. And so when we look at this idea of creating a society of truth, it goes in and outside of the courtroom. These were not just written long ago. These were created for us in all generations. They were meant for us to look at, where is our system today? Where do I fall in that system? How many times have I been called into the courtroom? How many times have I given testimony outside of the legal infrastructure? And who is my neighbor? These are important tasks. These are important rules. Truth matters. Testimony is important. And now we're going to finish up with our 10th commandment.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Joel. Thank you, everyone. Everyone has risen to the occasion. Hannah, are you going to spotlight? Yes, no, maybe. There we go. Okay. Let's talk about the 10th commandment, the commandment that tells us not to covet. This asks us a really important question, which we didn't have time to get into today, but it's really, really worth thinking about, which is the order of the 10 commandments. You know, when you make a list, usually there's some rhetorical strategy to the list, especially if you're publishing a list. Is it most to least important, least to most important, the most universal to the most particular to the universal? Some people say the commandments are read horizontally, and that they relate to each other horizontally rather than vertically. Some people, in fact, the rabbis say they were all given bivat achat, in one word by God, that they were only ordered because human beings require order. We can't perceive of everything at once the way God can. But in any case, we have this as 10th. And in my view, it is 10th because of how it relates to the first and the fact that it's a gateway commandment. Let's look at it that way. Thou shalt not covet. Now, what is it that causes people to violate so many of the other commandments? Why would someone have a different God than their own? Because they covet the God of another. Why would someone steal? Because they covet something someone else has. Why would someone lie? To cover up the fact that they stole something. Swearing false testimony is to get away with something, generally. Murdering is that you generally covet the life of another. Adultery, pretty obvious that that has to do with coveting. So if you can avoid coveting, you will avoid, even breaking Shabbat. Why violate the rules of Shabbat? Because you covet shopping, you covet going out to the movies, or you covet the majoritarian culture and its ethos that surrounds you rather than your own. So if you think about it, if you can avoid coveting, as it prevents a lot of transgression. That's one reason I think this is such an important commandment. It is also the only commandment that when you violate it, no one else knows. Coveting is an entirely internal experience. You cannot tell by looking at someone whether or not they are coveting in that moment. And that's another reason why it's a commandment that, in a sense, we can all get away with all the time, as long as we don't necessarily act on it. When I began with Maimonides, I want to conclude with Maimonides and then talk about how 1 and 10 create this framework for everything that's in between. When the Rambam was trying to deal with what we call theodicy, God and the problem of evil, he came up with 3 different explanations for evil, each of which in its own way lets God off the hook for the problem, makes evil something other than a theological problem, a God problem. So the Rambam says there are 3 causes for evil. The first is nature itself, which isn't really evil, it just is. So for example, his point is, because we are made of flesh and blood, because we are corporeal beings, because we can act on nature, because we have agency, nature, therefore, necessarily must be able to act on us, which is an erudite way of saying we fall apart. Because we are made of flesh and blood, we all fall apart. Some of us more quickly, some of us more slowly, but all of us inevitably. And his point is that isn't evil. That is just what it means to be a human being. If you don't want to fall apart, be a stone. If you're going to act on nature, nature is going to act on you. And so these physical declines that we all go through is not a sign of evil. It's just a sign of being human. The second cause of evil is the evil, this is how the Rambam puts it, that one human being does to another. People commit violent acts against other people. But this, he also points out, first of all, is not predominant in human society. I said this right after those horrible murders in Texas, when I was asked about it. And what I would say to people, I talked about the metaphor of an eclipse, that for momentarily the sun can be eclipsed by the moon, but that doesn't mean that the sun's light and warmth are less powerful than the moon. It's only that these things do pass, and that most of them, this is what the Rambam is saying, most people are good. Most people are not violent. Most countries are not at war. Most people do not do harm intentionally to other people. But if there is harm done, it's a human problem, again, not a God problem. And finally, and most importantly, and this is what relates to the 10th commandment of coveting, Maimonides talks about this idea of hedonic adaptation, that if we have wood, we want iron. If we have iron, we want silver. If we have silver, we want gold. That it is never enough. That we keep adapting to our current level of blessings, and we want more. We want. And it is because we want too much, we eat too much, we drink too much, we buy too much, we hold too much, we grasp too much, that we end up destroying ourselves, both spiritually and physically. Now remember that Rambam was a physician, and some of you may not know that his family was in the gem trading business, and his brother lost the entire family fortune in a shipwreck. His brother had all the family's gems, all their jewels, and he went down in a shipwreck. And the Rambam's family was impoverished, and that set them on a path throughout the Middle East. So when we are not satisfied with what we have, when we covet, it ultimately leads to our own demise. And that this wanting, and wanting is the primary form of evil. Now, how does 1 and 10 relate? I am the Lord your God who led you out of Egypt, the land of Egypt, to be your God. I am the God of freedom. I liberated you. And then the last commandment against coveting is really a plea to each of us that we not return to slavery, that we don't give up our freedom to the tyranny and the idolatry of things. The psalmist had this technique called inclusio. It means a psalm that begins and ends with the same verse. It's a poetic form. I see the 10 Commandments as a poetic form, that we are the people of a God of liberation, and we ought never return to the slavery of the idolatry of things. Ezehu Ashir asks the Talmud, who is rich? And the answer, Hasamech bechelko, the one who is satisfied, happy even, with what he or she has. And that, I think, is a very, very powerful sermon for our era. Now, to conclude this beautiful hour and a half or so of learning, and it really has been, I'm so proud of all our rabbis and cantors, and thank you to Rabbi Nanis for putting this all together, and thank you, Hannah, for running all of this for us. It's now time for us to actually hear the chanting of the 10 Commandments, to recite the Aliyah blessing and hear the 10 Commandments. So, Cantor Kareth Spencer Shapiro, would you please join us?
Be allowed to show ourselves.
There we go. All right, I'm going to get out of the way and let our cantors bring it home.
I'm going to start us off, and I'll invite you all to please rise, because it's typical to stand as if we're all standing at the foot of Sinai together as we hear these words. And we're going to start with the blessing, as Rabbi Leader said. Baruch hu et Adonai hamevorach. Baruch Adonai hamevorach leolam va'ed. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher bachar banu mikol ha'amim, v'natan lanu et torato. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah.
Amen.
Anochi Adonai Elohecha, asher hotzeiticha me'eretz Mitzrayim, mibeit avadim. Lo yeh lecha Elohim acherim al panai, lo ta'aseh lecha fesa v'chol tmuna asher bashamayim mimal va'asher ואשר במים מתחת לארץ. לא תשתחווה להם ולא תעבדם, כי אנוכי אדוני אלוהיך אלקנה פוקד עוון אבות על בנים, על שילשים ועל רבעים לשונאי, ועושה חסד לאלפים, לאוהבי ולשומרי מצוותי. את שם אדוני אלוהיך לא תישא, את שם אדוני אלוהיך לשווא, כי לא ינקה אדוני את אשר יישא את שמו לשווא.
That was beautiful, Kareth. If you can, Hannah, if you can release my video. Right now it says I have no access. There we go. Thank you. And we continue. Zachor et Yom HaShabbat lekadesho, sheshet yamim tavod, ve'asita chol melachtecha, ve'yom hashvi'i Shabbat l'Adonai Elohecha, lo ta'aseh chol melacha, ata ובנך וביתך, עבדך ואמותך ופמתך, וגרך אשר בשעריך, כי ששת ימים עשה אדוני את השמיים ואת הארץ, את הים ואת כל אשר בהם, וינח ביום השביעי. על כן ברך אדוני את יום השבת ויקדשהו. כבד את אביך ואת אמך, למען יאריכון ימיך על האדמה אשר אדוני אלוהיך נותן לך. לא תרצח, לא תנאף, לא תגנוב, לא תענה ברעך את שקר, לא תחמוד בית רעך, לא תחמוד אשת רעך, ועבדו ואמתו, ושורו וחמורו, וכל אשר רעך. We join together now in the blessing after the reading of Torah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher natan lanu torat emet, v'chaye olam nata betochenu. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah.
Amen.
All right, we're all going to turn our cameras back on so we can all wish all of you a Chag Sameach.
Chag Sameach.
Chag Sameach, everyone.
Chag Sameach, everyone.
Chag Sameach. Have some cheesecake.
Chag Sameach, some blintzes.
And
with
sour
caviar.
Heavy cheese pizza.
Ah.
Cheese whiz. Just a whole can of
No,
cheese.
no. That's Omaha. That's Omaha.
With ketchup, David?
Nothing better.
Take some lactate first.
All right. Chag Sameach, everyone.
Chag
And I
Sameach.
thank you
Sameach,
again.
everybody.
Good night.
Shavuot Tov.